reflects on what happened 75 years ago.
Hello all. I usually don't do this, but I can't help starting it at least with a little levity. This is a story about Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and his friend Bernard Baruch. They were sitting in a park bench in Central Park in their late autumn years, and this gorgeous blonde went by. One of them turns to the other and says, "Oh, to be 60 again." That I think is rather appropriate for our crowd. Thank you all for inviting me to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to listen and hopefully give me a chance to answer some of your questions, if time permits. When I first talked to a group like this about my story, shortly after publication of the book in 2001, there were still a fair number of veterans of World War II in the audience. Some of them were part of units that liberated concentration camps of the kind that I was in, and at least one of them, the very camp that I was in. I told them at the time that I owed them big time, since if they had been even a few days later, I would not have been here talking to you today. During the 19 years now that have passed since the publication of the books, the number of such veterans has dwindled, and it won't be long before they will all be gone. The same is true about Holocaust survivors. I was just 12 years old when I was unloaded on the train platform of the Auschwitz concentration camp, and I just, quote, celebrated my 87th birthday. I believe that there is some historic significance to the fact that the current generation of audiences will be among the last who will be hearing the story of those tumultuous and terrible days from the mouth of someone who lived through them. While the early part of my life was dominated by turmoil, upheaval, and horror, most of the latter part of it was spent under slightly more benign circumstances practicing law in California. The fact that I chose the law as a career is due to a number of reasons. But there is little question in my mind that after witnessing the breakdown of the basic norms of civilized behavior and the repudiation of the rule of law, tolerance, and human dignity, I was strongly drawn to a profession which ideally at least holds up as it goes the values that were so brutally trampled upon by the Nazi atrocities. For almost 40 years following the war, I put the events and memories of that earlier period out of my mind. During those intervening years, I've heard and read about Holocaust survivors and even their children who would not talk or think about the things that happened because the memories were too painful. I have to admit that this was not the case with me. I shut the past out simply because I did not consider it relevant. I was in a new country, starting a new life, and my focus has always been on the future, not the past. Then, starting about the mid-1980s, 40 years after the war, two things happened that changed my attitude. First, I came to realize that you can't chop your life up in compartments and jettison those that are not considered irrelevant. Your past is part of you, whether you like it or not. Second, as a representative of the Safeway supermarkets for whom I worked at the time, and who was a major contributor, I attended the opening and dedication of the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. in 1992. While there, and as part of a tour, I was given access to the archives, including the log of prisoners entering the Mauthausen concentration camp. As I stared at the microfiche, there was the following entry for September 19, 1944. Bernat Rosner, prisoner number 300703. As I looked at that banal, bureaucratic notation, the floodgate of memory and emotion opened and overwhelmed me. In that regard, you must remember, there is not a picture, document, or any tangible thing that connects me to my former life. The upshot of these reflections and experience was a decision to tell my story. When I was ready to do so, a series of coincidences, which in their own way are as unique as any other aspect of my life, brought it about that I met and made friends with a man by the name of Tubach, whose background and history could not have been more different than mine. While I was a Jew and a survivor of Auschwitz, Fritz was raised in wartime Germany. His father was a Nazi, and Fritz himself, in his early youth, was a member of the Jungvolk, the Cub Scout equivalent of the Hitler Youth. By the time we met in 1980s in Orinda, we had both become Americans. We both accepted the principle that you are responsible for your own actions and not for those of your father or other members of your nation or race. Over the years, we formed a friendship. We discovered that we both had fascinating stories to tell, and we decided to tell our stories together. The result was a book called An Uncommon Friendship. The reason for the title is rather obvious, which has enjoyed a fair degree of success, has been translated into German, Italian, and Dutch, and which is one of the reasons, probably the main reason, why I'm standing before you today. The rest of what I have to say will consist mainly of telling you something about myself, where I came from, what I went through, and how I ended up where I did. I was born 87 years ago in a smallish town by the name of Tubach in rural Hungary. For the first 12 years of my life, I had a basically normal and happy childhood. Obviously, it was a different childhood that people had in this country, but it was basically normal. An important part of my personality and makeup was shaped by the rigor and discipline of a Jewish Orthodox upbringing and a sensitive and literate mother. Both of these influences imbued me with abiding love for books and learning. Anti-Semitism was certainly not unknown in Hungary, and it existed in a good measure in our village, going back as far as I can remember. It was institutional in terms of laws that restricted the freedom of Jews from practicing certain professions or owning land, and limiting the number of Jews who could be admitted to law, medical, journalism, and other professional schools. It was also personal in terms of Jews being bullied, held up to contempt and hostility, not by any means by all of the non-Jewish population, but by a substantial segment of the community, many of whom were members or followers of the Hungarian version of the Nazi and other racist parties and factions. But this was not the virulent and deadly doctrine of extermination, as practiced and preached by Hitler and his thugs, and the anti-Semitic undercurrents running through the Hungarian cultural and political life did not significantly affect my everyday life and my basically happy and normal childhood. All this changed with dramatic suddenness on a very specific date, March 19, 1944, relatively late in the course of World War II. I remember the day very well. I was on my way home from a study session in preparation for my upcoming bar mitzvah, when a neighbor woman asked if I'd heard the news. When asked what news, she told me that the Germans had taken over the country and the government. The effects of the Nazi takeover on the Jews of Hungary were immediate and disastrous. I will limit my account to what happened to me, to my family, and to the Jewish community of Tubach. Within days following the takeover, the stream of anti-Jewish edicts began. Jews could not travel without specific permission. Soon they could not travel at all. Prominent families in the community, as well as those suspected of subversive activities or associations, began to disappear. By mid-April, all Jews had to wear a prominent yellow star on their outer clothing. One of my memories is sitting in our living room the night before this edict went into effect, and my mother sewing the yellow stars onto our sweaters and jackets. By mid-May, all Jews were herded into a ghetto. My family was lucky in this respect. Our home was within the area that was designated as part of the ghetto. But our 3-room home, instead of just housing my immediate family, became home for numerous relatives, as I recall between 16 to 18 in all, whose residences were outside the ghetto boundaries. The end of the Jewish community in Tubach came during the latter part of June 1944. On 24-hour notice, we were ordered to be ready for departure in front of our home with no more than 1 suitcase per person. 3 images stand out for me from the day we marched down the main street of Tubach to the unused brickyard next to the railroad station. The first was the attitude and behavior of the non-Jewish inhabitants. A relatively small number stood out on the sidewalk as we were being herded by and made jeering comments like, "You Jews are finally getting what's coming to you." The great majority of the town people retreated into their homes, closed their blinds to shut out the sight of their fellow citizens being driven down the street like cattle. The second was at the public school of all places, on the way to the station, where I witnessed my mother's humiliation at being stripped naked in a crowded room and hand-searched by Nazi thugs. The third was at the brickyard, with only bare earth for accommodations, where an elderly woman stood up to recite her Sabbath prayers and was clubbed bloody and unconscious by one of the guards. From Tubach, we were shipped to a collection point about 50 miles away, where we were unloaded onto a large open field. There, we were joined by approximately 7,000 to 10,000 others collected from other ghettos in that part of Hungary. From there, during the first week of July of 1944, we were loaded onto cattle cars, between 40 to 50 men, women and children per car, headed for Auschwitz. We arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on approximately July 7. I remember it was a Friday. By the time the sliding door of the freight car, which remained mostly locked throughout the 5-day journey, was opened, there were at least half a dozen corpses or near corpses in the car, and many more whose minds were unhinged. On the train platform at Auschwitz, there was chaos, brutality, and confusion. But my immediate family, my mother, my father, and my younger brother, was still together. The first thing that happened as we stood there dazed was an order on the loudspeaker that those in charge of each cattle car had to report somewhere. My father was designated as in charge of our car, but what his duties were was never clear to him or anyone. When the announcement was made, he left us, and I never saw him again. The next announcement was that men and women should separate because showers would be given. By this time, my mother was quite frightened and insisted that we two boys stay with her. Being a 12-year-old, I said I wasn't about to take a shower with a bunch of women. My mother did not argue, but left me with the admonition: whatever you do, make sure that you stay with your brother. With those words, she left us, and I never saw her again. Next, all the males were ordered to line up in a single file to be inspected by 2 SS officers. The officer looked at each person as he reached the head of the line, and those who looked able-bodied and fit to work were sent to the right. Those who looked too young, too old, or otherwise unfit to work were sent to the left. My brother, who was just over 10 years old, was in front of me in the line, and the SS officer, without hesitation, sent him to the left. Harking back to my mother's admonition, and without realizing the consequences of my action, I followed my brother to the left. I was about 3 steps past the SS officer when he reached over, grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, and shoved me over to the right. To this day, I do not know whether the Nazi thought that I just might be old enough to be able to put to work, or whether he was simply irritated because I made my own decision without being told what to do. In any case, that shove from the left to the right made the difference on that day between my ending up in the gas chambers within the hour, as did the rest of my family, and my surviving that initial screening process. My ordeal obviously did not end with that fateful shove. Every day for the next 10 months, until my liberation by the Americans during the first week of May 1945, was a battle for survival. That battle took several forms. At first in Auschwitz, it was a matter of trying to avoid being sent to the gas chambers. This was because even though I survived that initial screening, I kept flunking the physicals that the prisoners were subjected to in order to qualify for a permanent work assignment. By mid-September 1944, I realized that most of those remaining in my barracks consisted of the old, the sick, and those like me, too young to be selected for work. At that point, I still did not accept the stark truth, even though there was one of the chimneys of the crematorium belching out this horrid, acrid smoke, was less than a quarter of a mile from me. But I couldn't accept what was going on, but I did realize by then I learned enough that the setting and the company I was with was not a good place to stay. At that point, in a desperate move that is described in the book, I managed to get into a transport out of Auschwitz to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. It is ironic that in the annals of the Holocaust, Mauthausen is considered one of the most brutal camps that the Nazis ran. But for me, it was literally a lifesaver. I only had to worry that I'll be killed if I got sick or couldn't work. I wasn't just automatically put in the gas chamber. From then on, my battle for survival was mostly a matter of fighting and trying to survive hunger, cold, brutal beatings, overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and just about every other privation known to mankind. To illustrate, let me give you a brief picture of a typical day at the Mauthausen concentration camp. I will start with bedtime in the evening. Our sleeping accommodations were triple-decker bunk beds, but instead of one person per bed, we were squeezed 3, sometimes 4 persons per bed. The result was horrible overcrowding, with people fighting with each other for every inch of available space. There was no mattress on the beds, sometimes some filthy ground-up straw, often just wooden boards. One night, I offered a deal to my bunkmates. If they let me have the single blanket we were allotted, I would go down and sleep on the floor under the bed and free up some space on the bed. My offer was accepted, and that was a win-win situation in Mauthausen. We were woken up about 6:30 in the morning, mostly with shouts, but if the overseers thought we were not quick enough, then with clubs. Our barracks, housing about 100 men, had 2 faucets and 1 3-hole latrine for sanitation. By 7, we had to be outside the barracks and line up for roll call. We had to stand and wait for the German officer to show up to receive the roll call from the prisoner barracks chief. Sometimes the German would not show up for hours or more, and we had to stand there in the rain, snow, or bitter cold until he showed up and received his report. This was during the late fall and winter months, and we only had thin striped prisoner uniforms for clothing. After roll call, we had breakfast, which consisted of a brown, lukewarm liquid they called coffee. After breakfast, the able-bodied prisoners were sent out on work details. Since I was small and frail-looking, I generally was not picked for work. Instead, all of us who were not picked for work had to stay outside the often freezing cold. To ease our discomfort, we huddled against each other for body heat. One amusement of the more brutal overseer guards was to start beating the outer layer of this huddled mass with clubs and watch the whole group break into a stampede. In the course of these stampedes, my feet got trampled on, resulting in cold sores that never healed during my time in the camps, and the scars are still there today. For lunch, we were served a cup of greasy liquid called soup, made out of dried beets and, fortunately you have already had your lunch, dead maggots floating in the liquid. Our dinner consisted of a slice of bread with a square of margarine or a scoop of jam. During my 10 months of imprisonment, I never had a glass of milk or a piece of fruit. The only exception was one day when we were carrying airplane parts on a public street, and a woman was walking ahead of us, eating an apple. She looked around furtively to see that there were no guards looking, and then threw the half-eaten apple on the ground. I was the lucky one who picked up the apple, took a bite, and then shared the spoils with my best friend. To add to our misery, the unsanitary conditions resulted in an enormous infestation of lice. We spent much of our days squirming and scratching, and our evenings trying to kill the vermin that were crawling on our clothing. A very large number of prisoners contracted typhus as a result, and many of them died of the disease. I too contracted the disease, but fortunately, the symptoms did not show up until after I was liberated by the Americans in early May, and I was cared for and recovered in an American field hospital. I woke up after several days of lying unconscious. I was put on a scale. At the age of 13, I weighed 26 kilos, or approximately 52 pounds. After the war, many magazines and newsreels showed pictures of the cadaver-like creatures that emerged from the camps upon liberation. Well, I was one of them. People often ask me how we felt when we were liberated. First, I will tell you how we found out we were liberated. This was during the first week of May 1945. The weather was cold and miserable. It snowed the day before. We were in a temporary makeshift camp in the middle of a forest. We could hear the explosion of the artillery, which was initially relatively distant, was getting nearer every day, and the earth was starting to shake. The ground outside the barracks was knee-deep in mud. Suddenly, one of the prisoners burst into the barracks yelling, "Hey, the guards are gone." That is the way we found out that we were liberated. When we realized what was happening, did we burst into tears of joy or dance in the streets? The answer is no. What we did was to race to the storehouse, which contained the maggot-ridden ingredients for our soup, ripped the sacks open, and crammed this noxious stuff into our mouths till we were almost choked. I spent my first night of freedom trying to get some sleep on one of the sacks while the lice were crawling all over me, biting me to distraction. With all of the brutality and deprivation, there were instances of humanity and selflessness, sometimes from unexpected quarters. Let me give you two examples. The first involved a German soldier who was one of the guards when we were being moved from the Auschwitz to the Mauthausen concentration camp. The journey was by train in cattle cars, but the conditions were not nearly as terrible as those on the trip to Auschwitz that I described earlier. There were about 30 male prisoners per car. We had adequate sanitation and water and meager but regular meals. The guard with his rifle was quartered with us in the cattle car. During the first day of the 3-day journey, he was distant and unfriendly. By the second day, he unbent a little and for some reason took a liking to me. By that evening, he offered me some morsels from his dinner, which obviously was far superior to what the prisoners had to eat. Later that evening, he asked me to sing some songs that I remembered from my childhood. I felt that somehow, in that cattle car taking me to the next concentration camp, this German soldier and I had formed a bond. The second instance of some light in the dark days of my captivity involved my best friend and me. You could not possibly have survived the physical and emotional trauma of the camps without a buddy system, a friend to lean on, give support to, and receive support from. In my case, I found a boy about my age in Mauthausen, the second camp I was in, and we both felt that made a good fit. The name of this boy was Simcha, and there's a picture of the two of us in my book, which was taken shortly after the war. One night, in the middle of winter, somebody stole Simcha's shoes while we were sleeping. The shoes were not much. They were basically flip-flops with wooden soles, but they were all we had, and they certainly were better than nothing. So the following morning, Simcha had to walk barefoot through the snow and ice to the factory where we were working, about a mile away. While at work, the thief, a bigger boy, came up to us and said, "Guess what? I found your shoes, and if you give me your day's ration of bread, you can have the shoes back." Simcha and I knew that he could not possibly survive without his shoes, and neither could he survive with his ration of bread. The only solution was to try to make it for the day with a half a ration of bread for each of us, and to use the other half to retrieve his shoes. We did this without discussion or question. We both took it for granted that he would do the same for me if it was necessary. People sometimes ask me, were there any good days in the camps? I tell them, yes. It was the day I saved my best friend's life with a half a slice of bread. Very briefly, I will tell you how I ended up where I am, how a chance encounter in the summer of 1945 changed and gave new direction to my life. By that time, with the war in Europe over, I was in a refugee camp in Italy, in the town of Modena. I was alone, just over 13 years old, ragged and hungry. By then I finally accepted the fact that I lost my family and that there was absolutely no reason to try to get back to Hungary. There were thousands of kids like me hustling for an extra piece of bread, or if we were really lucky, some candy or a piece of chewing gum. The only source of those goodies was the American soldiers who were stationed near our camp. So naturally I spent much of my time hanging out near where the Americans were billeted. As I was standing there one day looking for a hustling opportunity, a jeep drew up loaded with 4 GIs and their duffel bags. I immediately ran onto the jeep, headed for the nearest soldier, and with sign language offered my services as a porter. He smiled and pointed to one of the bags. The bag was almost as big as I was, and my employer later told me that all he could see was the bag and 2 bare heels underneath pumping away with great energy. After I delivered his bag to his room, we tried to communicate, and we found that our only way of doing so was broken German. I told him about the situation. The words Mutter, Vater, kaputt by then slid easily off my tongue, and he was visibly moved. For the next 5 days, he spent all of his free time with me, taking me to movies and restaurants, treats I've never had before. We also did a lot of walking and talking. There's a picture in the book of the 2 of us taken by a street photographer. 5 days later, I met him. The soldier was transferred, but we started corresponding with each other. The upshot of this encounter, which I initially just regarded as a bright interlude in an otherwise dreary life, the upshot was that after the soldier returned to the US and was demobilized, he wrote me a letter offering to bring me to the US and to have me become part of the family. This story by itself is unique enough. What makes it even more remarkable is the fact that the GI who befriended me happened to be Charles Merrill Jr., the son of the founder of the Merrill Lynch financial empire. The rest, as they say, is history. When my friend Fritz and I embarked on our joint project, my intention was not to send a moral message. My intention was simply to tell my story because I realized that I had some obligations to discharge. First and foremost was an obligation to my 3 children who grew up in Orinda. As they grew up, they heard bits and pieces of the story, but never in a coherent and systematic way. More importantly, I kept the pain and emotion out of whatever I told them, and I realize now that this was more to protect myself than protect them. I also owed a debt to the family I lost. My mother, my father, my kid brother, and my extended family. The story of the Holocaust, how the millions were murdered, has been told many times, but their own story has never been told. I felt they deserved that be done, and it was up to me to do it. I also felt the story was a good and fascinating yarn that was worth telling. With all the horrors and suffering, there were moments of tension, suspense, and adventure. The truism that often truth is stranger than fiction applies, I believe, to several aspects of my life. But even though the story was not told to send a moral message, I believe it does so nevertheless. And it does so on several levels. The one that I believe is particularly relevant today is the ability of 2 individuals who come from historically different beginnings to be able to surmount the walls that could have divided them, to look beyond the conventional mindset that could have made them, if not hate, at least distrust each other. Instead of being strangers and adversaries, they formed a friendship and told what I believe is a warm and inspiring story. Thank you.
And this is for you for coming here and telling a story that has to be told and needs to be heard, and we appreciate it. Bernie, thank you very much.